These boxes were made using a technique that I'll be demonstrating in this video. I'm a beginning woodworker and I have been learning how to build this type of box because it's simple and stylish, yet not so basic that it lacks artistry or challenge. And most of these techniques can be modified to any skill level or workspace. So this is a prototype of the box we'll be making. I didn't put a hinge for the lid on this one, but I will add one for the box that we are making for this video. I used walnut for the inside liner and for the bottom, and quarter sawn oak for the top and sides. Here's a close-up of the type of joint we'll be making, which is basically a very simple box joint with just one notch. The inset bottom piece also looks nice and gives a nice finished look. Also, the end grain that shows on the joints usually finishes darker and really adds a nice stylistic component. So the first thing you want to do is determine the size of your box and cut the sides appropriately. It's also good to label each side so you can keep track of their orientation and position throughout the building process. The two long sides should be exactly the same, as should the two short sides. I'm using 3/8 of an inch thick red elm for the sides of this box, and I've cut these long sides to about 11 inches in length, and the short sides of the box are cut to about 5 inches long. And all of the sides need to be exactly the same height, which in this case is about 3 inches. I chose this size so I could use this piece of 1/4 inch thick red elm for the top, and so I could use this 1/4 inch thick piece of walnut for the bottom. So that means that this box will be approximately 11 inches long by 5 inches wide by about 3 1/4 inches tall when completed. Next, we will determine the size and position of the joint that will bind the corners of the box. When figuring out the dimensions, you just have to remember that the 1/4 inch thick top piece is going to be glued on top of the sides. So I'll use this scrap piece of 1/4 inch thick wood to help visualize the finished height of the box. You can also factor in that we'll be losing about 1/8 inch of material when we cut the top of the box apart from the body, which usually happens at the top of this big notch. This will make sense later. But now that I've marked where the notch will go, I can shade in the area that will be cut to give an idea of how it will look. Since my sideboards are 3/8 of an inch thick, that will be approximately how deep I will cut the notches for the joints. So this is how the corner joints will line up. And eventually we will mark the areas on the short sides where the wood will be taken off as well. And that would look something like this, just to give you an idea. If you don't have dado blades, you can always use your regular saw blade along with your regular crosscut sled or miter gauge setup. But I will set up my dado blades so that they cut just over 1/4 of an inch wide. This will help when we use the same setup later to cut our grooves for the bottom piece. I first want to adjust how deep the blades will cut into the sideboards. I want them to cut just a little bit deeper than the thickness of the boards, which are 3/8 of an inch thick. So using my crosscut sled, I will use one of the sides as a gauge and adjust the blade height so that I can feel the teeth protruding just over the edge. This ensures that the cut will be just a little deeper than the width of the board. Then I'll make a test cut on a scrap piece of wood to verify that the depth of the cut is just greater than the thickness of the board. And this looks about right. I usually want the cut to be about 1/16 of an inch deeper than the thickness of the board. You'll also want to clamp a backing board to your sled before making your cuts. This will help minimize and prevent tear out. Now it's time to start removing some material. I will first make cuts on the guidelines that will define the outer edges. Then all I have to do is clear out the space in between. This is easier to show than to explain. Once I line up the edge of the blade with the line I marked on the wood, I clamp a stop block. This is very important because it will ensure that all of the following cuts line up perfectly. I'm starting here with the bottom area of the A side, the long side. So I'll make a cut and then flip the side over and make another cut on the bottom as well. Here's another angle of how I flip the board to ensure that both cuts are the same distance from the bottom. Then with a stop block in the same place, I'll do exactly the same to the other long side, the C-side piece. So this is what we've done so far on the long sides. We've just basically defined the bottom edge of that notch that we're going to clear out. Now we're going to line up the other mark on the A side with the other edge of the blade and put up a stop block just like we did before, but on the other side of the blade. Then, just like before, we make a cut, flip, and make another cut. Then we do the same thing to the C side. Now that we have the outer edges of our notches defined, all we have to do is clear out all the material in between. We don't even need to measure or even use a stop block. And this is what it looks like in real time. I usually will make several passes to make sure I get a clean cut, and then I'll try to overlap my cuts so that the line is very clean and smooth along the edge. Now we'll switch into overdrive to save a little time. And here's the finished notch. Now we flip the board and do the same to the other side. And then we do the exact same routine with the other long side. And now we have all of our notches cut for the long sides of the box. And now we need to mark more precisely where we're going to move material from the short sides of the box. So I just line up the pieces that are to join each other and mark the short side pieces at the edges of the notches. You can also shade in the areas that are going to be removed. It can help you remember which side of the line needs to be cut. Now we're going to do about the same routine as before, except we'll be cutting to the outside of the marked areas to create a tab, which will fit into the notches on the other sides of the box. Notice I don't even need to use a stop block here. I just line up the line with the edge of my blade, and I won't go all the way to the line. I'll try to gradually sneak up on the cut so that I can get the fit just right and not too loose. And once I make that first cut, then it's just a matter of clearing the rest of the material. Now we're going to do the same thing to the other side, and we're going to create our notch. Just like so. So this is about as loose of a joint as I really want. It really doesn't matter. You can fill the gaps, but it's just a little bit too loose, but it'll be fine. And this joint over here is about right. It's snug, but not too snug. Fits together nice and tight. And here are the sides all fit together. It's nice if you can get the joints to fit snug enough so that you can pre-assemble the sides. It helps when you get to the gluing stage and also helps you visualize how things are going to fit. Notice on this finished prototype how the bottom piece is inset. We'll do that by using a dado blade and cutting a 1/4 inch groove along the inside of the sides of the box. So I'll position the blades so that they're about halfway into the thickness of the boards. And I position the fence so that it leaves about an 1/8 inch gap between the blade and the fence. I'll then use scrap pieces of wood to make many test cuts to make sure I have the grooves in the position that I want them. My goal is to get the grooves to be exactly halfway in between the thickness of the sides. And that looks about right. Then make sure that you have your side pieces oriented so that you're cutting on the inside bottom of each side, and make the cuts. The downside to making the bottom grooves in this manner is that we will eventually have to plug 4 holes on the short sides of the box. Perhaps a better method would be to use a plunge router or a table router so that you can make the grooves so that they don't go all the way to the end of the boards. But I find that plugging the holes is not a big deal, and I don't have those other kinds of routers anyway. So now we've got our grooves and we're ready to size the bottom piece of walnut to fit into the box. So I'll figure out which piece of walnut I want to use, and then I will make a rough mark and cut the approximate size of the piece that I want to use. Then you just measure the depths of the grooves, which is about 3/16 of an inch. Add that to the total inside dimensions of the box and cut your bottom piece accordingly. I'm also going to cut the top piece to its approximate size at this point, because I'm going to apply finish to both the top piece and the bottom piece before I assemble and glue everything together. It's okay for the top piece to be oversized because we're going to trim off the excess after gluing. I will usually gradually trim the bottom piece until I can fit the box together without any gaps in the joints and everything fits snugly. At this point, we're ready to glue everything together, but before I do that, I usually go ahead and apply finish to the inside surfaces of the box. I'll do a separate video on finishing, but for the next couple minutes I'll just outline the basics of what I do before gluing everything together. I usually finish the inside surfaces of the box with shellac, and I finish the exterior of the box with an oil-based finish. I'll finish both sides of the bottom piece and the inside surface of the top piece. Eventually, we'll cut off the top of the box, so I like to also apply finish to the area on the sides that will become the interior sides at the top. And I also apply finish to what will become the little lip on the bottom of the box as well. This top part of the side will become the interior side of the top piece once we cut it off, and this will be the bottom lip. Notice I've masked off the small tabs on the long pieces. That's because those areas are going to receive glue and I don't want finish seeping into that area of the wood. Now that I'm finished, we're ready to glue everything together. I've got the oil finish on the exterior of the bottom piece. I've got shellac on the inside of the bottom piece. And on the sides, I have put shellac on the top strip, and I've put the oil varnish on the bottom lip. And I've added a shellac finish to the inside of the top piece. So we're ready to go. So one more thing that I do before I start gluing is I usually like to scuff up the areas that are going to be glued. And this also takes off some of the finish that might have gotten on there when I was finishing the inside surfaces. I've got my wood glue, which is Titebond Original in this case. And I usually place an old piece of scrap wood on the workbench so that I'll have something to lean the pieces on while I work. It's always good to practice your work routine before you start actually applying the glue. I usually use a glue brush, and I try not to put the glue on too liberally because it really makes a mess with the squeeze out, especially trying to clean out the inside of the box. But that said, you also want to coat it pretty well, so I usually err on the side of caution and put too much glue on, which is fine. Just be ready to clean it up. Then I'll go ahead and install the bottom piece, which will kind of serve as a guide from here on out, which is kind of nice. Then I more or less follow the same routine when gluing the rest of the joints. Okay, so we'll clean up as much of the squeeze out as we can and start applying the clamps. Once we have the clamps in place, we keep taking out the squeeze out, and one little trick that I learned from somewhere was to break apart a popsicle stick and use that to get into these small crevices to get the glue out. You want to make sure all of the joints are flush, and of course the squeeze out on the outside doesn't matter because we're going to be sanding all of that off. And I'll usually leave it clamped like this overnight. And once we take the clamps off, we can see that everything looks good. We got a little bit of glue residue on the bottom, which came off actually pretty easily with my fingernail. And here we go with the sides. Everything's fit pretty well. And next we're going to plug those holes that we made when we cut the grooves for the bottom piece. But before we get into that, I'm going to protect the finished sides of my bottom piece using some paper and some masking tape. Next, I'm going to find a piece of scrap material from the same wood that I used to make the sides, and I'm going to try to match the grain pattern as close as possible. Then I'm going to cut off a strip that's approximately the same size as the hole. Notice that I've marked the outside edge so that I can always keep track of the orientation. Then it's just a matter of sanding the piece until it fits snugly into the hole. And we're not quite there, we need just a little bit more. And there we go. All we've got to do is add some glue, cut off the excess, and then we can move on to the next one. The end grain will darken substantially once you add the finish, and it will barely be noticeable. Now we're ready to start thinking about gluing on the top piece, but before we can do that, we've got to make sure that the surface that we're gluing it on is completely level. And we'll do that by using our sanding board. I'll usually sand in a circular motion one way and then circle back the opposite way for the same number of turns, then flip the box over and do the same routine over and over again until I've got a completely flat surface. The sanding board is a piece of fake marble tile with a couple sheets of sandpaper attached to it with double-sided tape. Once I've figured out the exact position of the top piece, I'll turn the box upside down and mark guidelines so that I'll know exactly how to position the box when gluing. I'm then going to take a piece of scrap that's the same thickness of the sides of the box, and I'm just going to mark a line that will help show me where the sides are going to be positioned against the top of the box. Remember that there's a layer of shellac on this piece of wood, so I'm going to try to use these sanding blocks to scuff up the areas where the sides are going to be glued onto the top. So when all done, it looks something like this, and I will also go around the edges of the top with my sanding block as well, just a little bit, and the top will fit on like so, and is ready to glue. So I'm going to go ahead and mask off that top edge with some tape, and I'm going to make sure I've got the orientation right on my top. I'm going to flip it over in the way it's going to be glued, and now all I have to do is apply the glue. I find that using about one bead of glue along each edge is plenty of glue. And I'll eventually smear this around with a glue brush or my finger. Then it's a matter of just positioning the box against your guidelines and trying to make sure your box doesn't swim around too much in that glue. And as soon as I get it positioned perfectly, I'll add a couple boards on top and then add some weights on top of that. And what I'm trying to do is just get the glue to set up a little bit so that it won't slide around once I start putting the clamps on. And after about 5 minutes, we take the weights off and I can start putting the clamps on. I'm starting with very light pressure on the clamps so that the top doesn't slip around. And then I'll add more and more pressure as I add clamps. It seems you can never have enough clamps. I have a mix of very nice clamps and very cheap clamps. And there we go. We'll let this sit overnight and then take the clamps off and see what we've got. Okay, everything looks good and we're ready to start trimming off some of the overhang of the top. I find that using the crosscut sled is a good way to visualize where you're going to cut. And I'm going to try to trim the excess off to about where the sides are protruding there, at about 1/16 of an inch past the surface of the side. And this is what we're left with, and we're ready to move on to the belt sander to level everything off. I realize this is probably not the most ideal way to level off the sides, but unless you have a bandsaw, I can't think of a more practical way to do it. But you just have to be very careful and have a very light touch. I constantly change directions and constantly check progress to avoid taking too much material off and making the sides uneven. So far so good. Now we just have to continue our way around the box, and it's the shorter sides that are often the most challenging for me. Okay, so far so good. You can see our joints there where we plug the holes. Looks okay. Those will darken nicely when the finish gets into the end grain. And now we're going to use our sanding board again to even up the bottom, make everything level, and make sure that it sits nicely. Okay, it looks good. Everything is flush and smooth. So the decision I'm faced with now is whether or not I want to round these corners on this box. I've always wanted to make a box with square, sharp corners, and this box, the grain on the wood would lend itself well to that, I think. The problem is, and the problem with this method of using the belt sander, is that you never get a perfectly square 90-degree angle on the sides and the corners. So what rounding the edge does is it detracts the eye from that, and it kind of just brings everything together in a more cohesive aesthetic, if you will. But what I thought I would do is wipe this down with some mineral spirits to see what it's going to look like finished, and then try to make a decision off of that. And I might even go ahead and put a layer of shellac on there and see how that looks. And I can always, round it after a couple layers of shellac and just resand everything. So now I've just doused this with mineral spirits, which will evaporate soon, but you can kind of see, looks very nice. So I think I decided I am going to round the corners. I'm looking at this dark edge on the top here. I think it just might look good rounded. I don't know. Something about it like this still looks a little unfinished to me, and the rounding just kind of brings it all together. So to do that, I'm going to use a handheld router. This is a 1 horsepower, it's a Bosch Colt. And I'll put a 1/4 inch rounding bit on that. And then we'll just go around the top of it and round those edges. So before I cut the top off, I want to make sure that these edges are nice and rounded the way that I want them, and that there's no little lines from the router showing around the edge. I'm going to smooth everything out, then I'll sand everything to 400 grit and apply several coats of shellac. I'll use as many coats of shellac as it takes until I don't have to worry about the grain raising and having to sand it smooth again. Then I'll be ready to cut the top off. I'll use an orbital sander with 120 grit paper to try to take off the marks used by the router. Then I'll typically go to 180 grit and sand the entire box with a 180, and then from there I'll go to 220, and then to 320, and then to 400, and sometimes I'll even take it up to 600. But for the first go around, 400 is plenty fine enough. Remember, I'll be applying many layers of shellac, and it'll need lots of sanding anyway, but this is a good start. So now I will douse it with mineral spirits just to see if there's no stray marks that I missed or any rough spots, and it looks all good. But what I did figure out was that I needed to dull the corners just a little bit. They were getting a little bit sharp. So just run over it a little bit with some 220 grit, I think this is, just to dull those corners. So now I'm ready to start applying shellac, and I'm only doing this as a pre-finish to help prepare the wood for the oil varnish, which will come later. And I'm going to apply just enough to raise the grain and then sand it down and raise the grain and keep doing that until the grain no longer raises up. So I'm kind of using the shellac as a grain filler, and hopefully it will save time in the long run while also pointing out any flaws that there might be in the sanding. And after several cycles of shellacking and sanding, we have a smooth surface, and we are ready to move over to the table saw and make the cut to cut off the top of the box. So I'm going to adjust the fence on my table saw so that the blade lines up right at the edge of that joint. I'm going to measure it from each joint to make sure I'm getting a cut right on that line. So here we go. I learned from somewhere that you're supposed to cut the short sides first, and that seems to work pretty well. but there's still a margin of error in cutting this top off that's hard to overcome. There are a lot of angles at play here that prevent you from getting a clean cut all the way around, but fortunately there's a way to compensate for some of the errors, and we'll get to that in a moment, but I can tell you that it involves a lot of sanding. Now before you get to the last cut, you need to stop, and we're going to have to put a spacer in to keep that top from flapping around and to keep your top at a 90-degree angle up against the fence. So I'll use a couple popsicle sticks, which is about 1/8 of an inch, approximately the size of the blade, and we'll make the cut. And voila, you've got your top and your base. And while it looks simple, you really have your work just cut out for you at this point, literally. You're going to have to sand both of those down level so that the top fits flush. And here's what I mean by that. That little gap there, that is a lot of work, and the only way to do it that I have without a bandsaw is to use the sanding board and manually grind those down until they seat flush together. And for the sake of the video, I'm going to condense about 2 hours of sanding into about 15 seconds right here. But it works like a charm every time. It just requires some patience and some elbow grease. So now it's time to cut and install the walnut liners that are going to go around the inside of the box. I usually measure and cut the pieces so that they stick up about 3/16 of an inch. And I'll use this 1/8 inch thick piece of walnut. And at first I'll just make sure they're cut long enough to where they're a little bit longer than what I need on either side. Then I'm going to adjust the blade of my table saw to 45 degrees and use this little jig using my miter gauge to make the cuts. I'll start by cutting the first bevel near the edge of one of the ends of the boards. Then I'll place a mark where the next cut needs to be. And I'll usually try to gradually creep up on that mark with my cuts. It takes a little bit of practice to learn exactly where the angled blade is going to cut. But I was fortunate in this cut in that I got a snug fit on the first try, which almost never happens. This is more like a typical scenario. As I'm trying to sneak up on that line with my cuts, I left the piece a little bit long, and it doesn't take much. As you can see here, it's about a little less than 1/16 of an inch long, so I'm going to have to trim this down a little bit more. This time I'm going to position the board so that it's just barely brushing up against the blade. I'm going to give it one more slice. As it turns out, that was about all that was needed. We get a nice snug fit, and we're ready to cut the other two short sides. Basically, I'm going to do everything the same way as I did for the long sides, except for on the short sides, now that we have the two long pieces in place, we've got to account for a little bit of size discrepancy. It's going to be a little bit shorter than the measurement, as you can see here. So we'll need to shave a little bit more off and just keep working it until we get a nice snug fit. And there we go, that looks good. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the last piece. And I'm not going to go ahead and install all of these pieces right now because they'll be impossible to get out of there. Instead, I'm going to sand all of these down to about 400 grit and then finish them with shellac, just like I did the bottom piece. I'm only going to finish the side that's visible, and I'm going to leave the back side unfinished in case I have to use some glue during the installation process. So I've got the finish on. I want to make sure it still fits nicely. And then I'm going to add a little bit of glue. And I'm not sure this is necessary, but I only do it to the two long sides. I only use a little bit of glue and only in the center of the piece because I don't want any squeeze out to get on the bottom or to squeeze out the top or around the corners. I'll then use a couple pieces of cardboard as protective cauls and clamp the lining down to the side of the box until the glue sets. I'll usually keep it clamped for a couple hours. And then I'll do the other long side in exactly the same way. And then the short sides I usually push in without any glue. Sometimes the shellac finish will add a little resistance or make the wood expand a little bit, and some small adjustments will need to be made. But usually it'll just push right in. And here's a situation where this piece of lining would not fit into the slot. So I took a piece of sandpaper and I tried to just gently take off just a little bit of material. But as you can see, it still presented a challenge getting it into the slot. And so now I'm past the point of no return, and you just have to carefully try to force it in there. So at this point, I will try clamping the sides to see if we can get just a little more room to slide this piece into place. Oh, that's pretty close, but not quite. There we go. The top fits on pretty well, but we're going to have to do a little bit of sanding to make sure that it opens and closes as smoothly as possible. So I've masked the top of the side pieces, and I'm just going to use my sanding block and work my way around and take off some material and test the opening and the closing of the top as we go. So it's getting better. The sanding block was pretty aggressive at 80 grit. I think by the time I run through all the grits and smooth it out up to 400 grit, it should be fitting pretty well. Also, don't forget about the corners. I'm going to just very gently knock the edge off of those sharp corners. And we're getting there, but I think I'm going to have to take a little bit of material off the inside edge of the top. And I think now we're about at a stopping point. I think a good test or goal is to be able to flip the top around and see if it fits. And in this case, it pretty much does. So I think we're good. So now I'm just going to sand through the grits and prepare these unfinished areas we've been working on to receive a few layers of shellac. So at this point we're looking good. The top opens and closes nicely. You can even turn the top around and it fits nice and snug, so I'd be able to get away with not putting a hinge on, although we are going to go through that in a minute. We've got shellac on all the surfaces, all the inside surfaces and the outside surfaces, and at this point it really could be considered completed if you wanted it to. But I'm going to go ahead and fit some hinges to the back, and I'm also going to put a coat of oil varnish on the exterior of the box. And in case you're wondering, those little glue spots on the bottom came off quite easily with just a fingernail and a damp cloth. I'm still learning about hinges, and installing them is an art form in itself. There are many ways to approach it, and most of them are beyond my skill set at the moment. So I'm going to demonstrate the simplest method that I've found, and I'm going to do each hinge a little differently. And I think that the second hinge installation example is better and more accurate, but they're both very simple. First, I'm going to visually assess and determine the approximate position of the hinges. Then I'm going to use my combination square as a guide for spacing each hinge in relation to its corresponding side edge. Then I will secure the hinges with a piece of tape so I can take a better look. One trick that I learned from a video somewhere is to use a business card as a spacer. This is supposed to keep the top and the hinge from binding and thus not being able to close all the way when the box is shut. The first method that I will show involves using an awl to mark the center of each screw hole, which you will then use as a guide for drilling the pilot holes. I've placed tape on my drill bit to ensure that I don't drill too far and go all the way through the sides. I will then drill and install each screw one at a time while checking my progress along the way. The second method that I've come to favor involves using a pencil or a pen to outline the screw holes instead of using the awl. I think that I'm better able to center the pilot hole this way. And there we go. Now that we have everything fitted properly and the hinges are working, we'll go ahead and take the hinges off again and continue with the finishing process. Next, I'm just going to give an overview of how I finished the exterior of the box. And I use a product called True Oil, which is an oil varnish blend like many others out there. The key is to apply a series of super thin coats, which is fairly easy. And after about 3 or 4 coats, the shine really starts to build up. I'll usually attack one side at a time and wipe it on fairly liberally, especially the first couple coats. Make sure that the varnish gets into all the little pores. And then I'll methodically, just very quickly wipe it off in smooth, even strokes. And I'll do the same thing to the other sides and also to all the other surfaces that need finishing. These pads that I'm using are actually 3" by 3" flannel gun cleaning patches. I got a bag of 400 of these for about $25. And I usually fold a couple of them together and it makes a nice little 1 by 1" pad. The first couple of coats don't have to be perfect because you're still filling in the grain at this point. Plus you're going to be sanding and using steel wool in between some of the coats. But you still want to make it as smooth as you can possibly make it. I usually let the coats dry for about a half a day or overnight. And then I'll come in with some steel wool or some very fine sandpaper, say 400 grit or 600 grit, if I need to even out the finish a little bit more. But I'll just go over it very lightly until everything looks kind of even and prepare the surface for my next coat. Using this particular finish, I'll usually use a minimum of 3 coats and usually 4 to 5 coats unless I have some troubled areas, and then I'll just keep going over it with the sandpaper or steel wool, reapplying the finish using very thin coats until everything levels out. The more coats I put on, the more dry time I allow for the coats to dry, And if the areas become too glossy, you can always knock them back with some steel wool, which I'll usually do after a few days or a week after the finishing is complete. Then I'll use the business card trick and reinstall the hinges and hope everything fits together back nicely and snugly, and we should be finished at this point. Like I said earlier, the finish might be a bit glossy at this point, and I'll probably end up knocking it down with some steel wool. But I'll just leave it for now and let it sit for a while and think about it. And there you have it. I hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching.